So welcome everyone. I'm going to stand in the camera so that I can make a proper introduction. Today we join me in welcoming Leyla Tiglay. Okay. I haven't had that opportunity to meet you before, but I've heard of you by reputation. I was going to announce this last, but I'll say it first. A former Ph.D. student in the political science department here at BU, who is now a Ph.D. candidate at Ohio State studying international history of the Cold War and decolonization. Currently an Ernest May Fellow in History and Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She's also a Peace Scholar Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and previously had fellowships from the Center for Grand Strategy at the Bush School of Government and the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. And today, her talk is on European security in the era of decolonization, France, Italy, Germany, nuclear cooperation as an alternative vision of transatlantic order from 1957 to 1959. And this talk is part of an ongoing lecture series that we call Europe in the World. And it is looking at the role of problematizing European security in the way of not just looking at Europe and the EU on its own, but looking at it in a larger context of historical colonization, decolonization processes, and current global governance processes. And that ongoing series is a part of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Security and Defense that I am working on for the last year and a half and for the next year and a half as part of the European Union Jean Monnet Chair series. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this, for this presentation. And it's great to see friendly, familiar faces here. Thank you for coming. So I'm looking forward to receiving your feedback for this part of my dissertation project. Broadly speaking, I'm studying early Cold War politics in the context of Franco-American relations and France's nuclear tests in Algeria over the 1960s. So today I will talk about the introductory section of my project, where I examine this short-lived nuclear cooperation of three major European continental powers. And overall, I will argue that this cooperation as a project, although it's an undertaking with a limited lifespan, had important implications for both the transatlantic and global nuclear politics. So I just want to give a brief overview of what was happening in this period in terms of European defense projects and cooperations. So in the 1950s, 3 attempts had been made to establish a European defense cooperation mechanism with some nuclear aspects. And the last one was the most interesting and most concerning to both the Soviet Union and the United States. So the first one was European Defense Community, EDC. It wasn't ratified in the French Parliament, and so it was a failed attempt. And it was substituted by the Western European Union in October 1954. And in this process, as part of this process, Germany agreed to unilaterally renounce the production of atomic weapons. And so that was part of Paris agreements, and they also put this important clause, rebus sic stantibus, which allows the treaty to become inapplicable in case where there's a fundamental change in circumstances. And this is one of the ways in which Germany has been able to enter into this, what we call FIG, France, Italy, Germany nuclear cooperation. And then another attempt was Euratom Treaty. It's a supranational management. So after 2 years of tough negotiations, they signed this treaty, which concerned only civilian nuclear power. And in this one, France especially had its own way. They managed to place some reservations on the treaty so that Euratom would not be entitled to check French military nuclear facilities as an agreement. And so this is pretty much the summary of the event that we call now France, Italy, Germany, Fig Nuclear Project. there are a series of agreements and deals made through the 1950s as part of this Fij cooperation. So the first one was signed in Colombechar in Algeria in the middle of the Algerian War of Independence. They signed, Germany and France signed this agreement. That was at the beginning of January 1957. And in this, for this agreement, Franz Joseph Strauss and French, German defense minister and French defense minister Maurice Bourges-Monnery were the ones who actually spearheaded this project at this very beginning. And Strauss is an important figure in this whole Fij cooperation. So this series of agreements included production of nuclear weapons, the means of delivery on the French territory, but with German and Italian participation in research, production, and financing. So it's really important to consider here the political economy of it, because Germany at that time had a surplus in its budget for arms purchases. And everyone was kind of interested in getting something from that share. And France's initial motivation was that. So it was pretty much economic and also political economic at the same time. The project overall went until de Gaulle's coming to power, until mid-1958, and he put an end formally to this nuclear project. So that's the summary of what happens. And also it's important to understand the broader context and the structural elements, like key factors that condition the decision-making and the behavior of various actors. So the technological superiority of the United States in the post-war period, especially superiority in nuclear technologies. So Americans, in a way, having that, they decided to go for a comprehensive nuclear strategy. And it meant that they would rely heavily on nuclear weapons in establishing order in international politics. So this has had some implications. The Transatlantic Alliance became an alliance of different zones of security. So US-British territories, because they had nuclear weapons in early 50s, as zones of sanctuary, and parts of continental Europe as endangered zones. And it enhanced the British position. And pretty much disadvantaged in the eyes of the contemporary actors, the continental Europeans. It also discouraged the British to be part of the integrated Europe, so they revived the special relationship framework with the United States at that time. And second important structural international political element that is generally ignored, and that's actually broadly what my research is about, understanding how decolonization affected, even shaped nuclear politics. So decolonization set the stage of everything that was happening at that time in this period. So one of the key events, which is key to this Fij project, was Suez Crisis. It really triggered all these reactions. It made this cooperation, this European nuclear cooperation, possible. Although, like, some of the tendencies were there, but Suez Crisis is really important. Algerian War, ongoing Algerian War, is really important to consider for understanding French nuclear policies, and also some broader anti-nuclear movements in Africa. And also Indochina War, which also conditioned these European colonial empires, which were decolonizing, which were collapsing at this period. So they all had, although this is in the context and it's hard to find these causal pathways, they all had in the context of this, of the nuclear decision making, also in the context of this Fij cooperation. And finally, Cold War in Germany, these twin questions, that's also part of the questions that the actors at that time were asking to themselves. They were grappling with the question of how Germany will be integrated into the West, in a global Cold War context, how Germany can be placed as an equal partner. And these are my research questions that guides me through this, this project, this part of the project. So the first question is, was this cooperation Europe's defense moment? Is it an alternative vision of order, or just mere posturing, a quid pro quo for European actors that they would be using in their negotiations, in their nuclear dealings with the United States and the Soviet Union? The second question is, how does the US reaction to this cooperation tell us about, it does tell us about the US decision making in this period, in the 1950s? I think it speaks broadly to US non-proliferation policies, what is also called inhibition strategies, which coexisted with containment strategies. But is it like the level of inconsistency maybe it's telling about this inhibition mission strategy of the United States? And the last one, and the most important one, which will be my contribution to the historiography, is, did this cooperation have global implications going beyond the transatlantic nuclear relations? I argue that it has, and so I just want to talk about that too in this talk. But before, I just want to, as a former social scientist, a political scientist, I want to touch the methods, sources, historiography, and some of the problems that relate to it in the context of my research. So this topic is actually exceptional in the sense that there is more secrecy in this topic than other nuclear history events and happenings. So it's really difficult to study that as a historian because probably because this relates to an unfinished project involving a top secret issue that is extremely sensitive. And this exclusive alliance and partnership was replaced by more like a NATO-based solutions to nuclear issues. So in a way, no one wanted to talk about that later during in the rest of the Cold War and until 1990s. And of course, declassification is not sufficient. And in some cases, the parts of documents that are declassified are just sanitized again when they are going online. So you can find the original document in the archives when you go there, and then in the online sources, it's removed. Sometimes another problem is oral history sources. There are no names. The sources are not given about a sensitive particular argument that is being made. This specifically happens with the French, in the French articles and books. They refer to unknown people. And memoirs, which is one of the primary sources, important primary sources, but of course they are always problematic for historians. They can distort reality, but in this case, like some memoirs, they totally overlook, ignore this cooperation, like the French defense minister, which was a leading figure, Jacques Chaban-Delmas. He doesn't mention at all about this. And other memoirs, diaries are contradictory. For instance, Strauss, German defense minister, he wrote in his memoirs, like the first agreement in Colombesha was just, had no nuclear component, was just conventional. But in the diary entry of Herbert Blankenhorn, he's the advisor to Konrad Adenauer, and he's an ambassador to NATO. You have a lot of evidence, substantive evidence about the nuclear components right from the beginning of this cooperation. There are other implications of secrecy. The terminology, they use different words for nuclear capabilities. It's sometimes modern weapons, sometimes restricted material, sometimes advanced weapons. So they refer to nuclear capabilities, but you never know what that is. And chronology is a little bit also vague, because when it starts, when it ends, there's always an element of vagueness in periodization. But in this one, I wanted to start that from the mid-1956, even before Suez Crisis, because there were dealings and conversations between German and French generals about the nuclear cooperation. And when it ends, it's even more complicated, because de Gaulle puts an end to it, but then Europeans continue to talk about nuclear weapons cooperation in some committees, in like only European committees. This is something that has been recently discovered by an Italian historian. And another problem is access to information. So the knowledge of the event was limited to a smaller circle, even within the small circle of nuclear decision making. For instance, J.R. Smith, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, Director of Policy Planning in this period, and he didn't know about that. So you never know who knew it, who didn't know it. We know that Eisenhower and Dulles were aware of it at very high level, but then some mid-level officials were aware in the Defense Ministry, in Pentagon, but not in the State Department, obviously. So it's really a bit complicated, and you cannot really, it's really difficult to understand how you are going to assess the effect of this event, of this cooperation on the overall policy making. And finally, this is a really transatlantic centered historiography. There is a lack of other perspectives, and especially the Soviet one. So we know that nuclear history is a top-down history, but in this case, even the Soviet Union's top-down effect is kind of ignored. It's mostly written and assessed by European and American, the transatlantic scholars. So I just wanted to put that too. These are all the articles and academic events. They were organized mostly in 1990s, and after this quick burst of interest, the topic didn't receive that much of interest on audience, with some exceptions from Italian historians mostly. So most of these are contributions to national historiographies, and there's a need to synthesize all these different perspectives and come up with an international history of this cooperation. So this is one of the contributions that I want to make to the historiography, like synthesizing all these different information. And to do that, I just decided to reconstruct the process by looking at different events, meetings, official reports related to this cooperation. And it is more some kind of a microhistory of how it unfolds, how it unfolded, to help see the dynamics involved. And I think this is also important to answer the question. So we look at the question of how when you look at the process, but it helps answering the question of why that happened and why it unfolded the way it did. So I will only talk about some of the key events and reports, and here I'm more centered on the US primary documents and the US perspective in this chronology. So here, as I said, I started in mid-1956 with these conversations between German and French generals, and then we see some of the statements of German Chancellor, and he said Germany cannot remain a nuclear protectorate of the United States in September, even like before the Suez Crisis pinnacle point. So I'm sorry, I'll just... So here, the first engagement, bilateral engagement, happened between Adenauer and French Minister Mollet in Paris in November. That was after the Suez Crisis. So Germany proposed in this bilateral contact, Germany proposed to bring this issue to the other members of the Western European Union, and they did that. And this multilateral engagement in November-December period didn't have that much of a positive outcome because the other countries, part of the Western European Union, were negative. Germany proposed them to put their own research and experimental establishment at the disposal of the committee for the in this Western European Union standing armaments. And then the protocol in Cologne-Béchar was signed between the two defense ministers. And then it continues with with some of the statements from German generals, and Heusinger was one of these important figures here. He was accompanying Strauss in his talks in Algeria and during this the signing of this treaty there, and he informed NATO staffs, but informally in the meetings about these meetings. But he did not really mention the nuclear aspects. He talked in a round way, one can say. Then an important speech. It was just before that one, that's German defense minister's speech. He said there in Germany, all European armies will eventually be equipped with atomic weapons, whether Americans approve it or not. And in American documents, they interpreted it as, so he implied he would also want equipping Germany with army with nuclear weapons. And then the UK enters into the equation at this very early stage of this cooperation. At that stage, neither the British nor Americans knew much about the details of the cooperation, and British expressed some concern about it regarding the future German activities. And then US Embassy in Paris published a report disseminating a report about these recent French initiatives. But they were really not alarmed at all. They rejected the idea that it had nuclear components, so they were not aware at that level, at that mid-level, State Department and embassy level. And the United Kingdom, Britain continued to be part of the process. And there were some exchanges between Americans and the British in this period, in this early period. So it's important to see how, why British were concerned about it. So Germany, according to them, Germany would play a prominent role, much more prominent role than the French in this cooperation because of its economic and technological capabilities. And the real danger to them was that in 10 years period, in longer term, Germany would have more sophisticated weapons. And they advised Americans, like a more general Western European Union or NATO cooperation in the field of research that would include them, British, along with French and Germans. So they were also concerned about, which was quite a smart thing to do, about the Soviet reactions. Because they thought that it would really galvanize Soviet reactions, and it may put in danger the disarmament negotiations and all of the ongoing diplomatic efforts. Sorry. So, as of March, we can see some new reactions, and the meeting at 20th April between Harold Stason, Louis Strauss, the Atomic Energy Commission, head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and Dulles. In that meeting, one can see the split between these people. So Harold Stason was the head of the disarmament head negotiator for disarmament, and he was more attuned to accepting the Soviet position in order to come up with some kind of a deal with them for the nuclear test moratorium. And he said that it was clear to him that the Soviet Union was very much concerned about a rearmed and uncontrolled Germany. And later, in this May 4 meeting in Bonn, with the participation of Strauss and German foreign minister and the defense minister, the Chancellor, Adenauer, said that it had been agreed that French and German military staffs and individual officials should be brought together as much as possible. So Adenauer really wanted that, apparently, but he was also very tactical. They were trying not to keep the secrecy, because at that time in Germany there was this important anti-nuclear mobilization and reactions from the public because of the ongoing nuclear tests as a reaction to them. So Germany was much more, as a public, German people were much more receptive to these issues and anti-nuclear tendencies. And finally, the end of May moratorium is an important one. Memorandum, sorry, it's an important one. It went from the State Department to London, and it said, it's difficult to predict what turn the thinking of such a nuclear community might take with regard to NATO and world affairs, although the result will be to enhance the influence and independence of the community. It will probably retain a defense alignment with the US. And they wanted UK to be part of it. And they were also skeptical towards the end of the memorandum, especially about these actors, European actors, developing some degree of political unity, which would permit them to take a largely independent course in foreign and defense policy. So they were concerned about that, and that report is from May 1957. That's also pretty much the very beginning of it all. And then exchange of letters through the summer between London and Washington, and also between different interagency conversation in the United States. And in August, there is another memorandum, which is telling. So the conclusion of this August memorandum is it's a report. They said there is a Franco-German agreement for joint research and perhaps production of advanced weapons, because it was really still they were not sure about, there was some level of vagueness about the nuclear aspects of the cooperation, but at that point they were sure it was nuclear. And it said, US policy as we understand it holds that we should not oppose Franco-German collaboration and exchange of atomic data among Western European Union countries may present some serious problems in the future. And they were also predicting that, although there were some restrictions for Germany because of the Paris Accords that I mentioned, it might be possible for the Germans to evade these restrictions with the help of the French. So they knew what was happening. The French would be helping for the nuclear technology as they had that kind of independence, whereas Germany would help them for financing and technology. And then comes Sputnik, which is an important crisis, an important moment, let's say, for European defense. And they were even more, at that time, became more resolute about having that cooperation after Sputnik. So you see in this process, it starts with some vague intentions, actually, and then it becomes something that becomes more solid. And there is this French cabinet meeting in November, which is important because they take the decision to sign a treaty, a more comprehensive treaty, including Italians. And Italians were interested because for them it was undesirable to have a bilateral Franco-German situation, and they wanted to be in too. And Adenauer agreed to the French proposal for his own reasons. He believed that since summer 1957, especially with also after Sputnik, he just noticed that there were these increasing signs of fatigue in anti-communism in the United States administration, and he was expressing his concerns about that to Eisenhower in the same period. And this important moment here is a treaty, the meeting and the treaty in November. So in this November 20 meeting, Strauss and Shaban Delmas in Paris, and also Herbert Blankenhorn was there, they decided to extend the cooperation in the fields of aircraft and rockets development. And nuclear research was now much more openly expressed. So now they were talking about nuclear as nuclear with the word. But they also, it's really interesting, they also in this meeting talked about how to make it less suspicious. So they played with the words because they were concerned about public reactions. They needed parliamentary, all of them, some parliamentary approval. And for this, it needed to look like less nuclear than it is. Sorry. So here, it's not working. Sorry. We come to, we reached that point, 1958. Italian defense minister all of a sudden decides to talk to Americans. They were involved in this cooperation, but they decide to have this conversation with Americans where he says that this is a nuclear weapons cooperation, and he makes it even more explicit. And it's not known why he does that. There is no explanation why this sudden situation arose. And then there is this important agreement of cooperation for the development of missiles in January. And Dulles spoke in the Congress. That's, to me, that's a really interesting aspect of this, of American policymaking, because he openly said that he was ready, he was prepared to have Germany rearmed and becoming a nuclear power, because he made this case for the use of the resources of the alliance in an efficient way, so they wouldn't spend all these efforts and money in order to come up with these nuclear technologies Americans can give them. And in March 5th, there was this important meeting. They called Defense Minister Strauss, and there was this meeting, and Americans at State Department level, Elbrick, he was Assistant Secretary of State. He didn't know, and he asked Defense Minister Strauss, so what's the nuclear aspects of this cooperation? We want to know exactly what that is. And Strauss indicated, or he just started to talk about it. He just said, at the beginning it was conventional, which was not true. That's in his memoirs too, but there are all the other evidence against that. And it was this meeting was some kind of an interrogation of Strauss. And that was really interesting. But even after that, he just continued to give interviews and saying, in a British newspaper, I can guarantee that there will be no German nuclear programs for 3, 4, 5 years, but then if the other nations, especially the French, make their own bomb, Germany might be interested. So again, there's this American concerns about it in the archives. So I just don't want to talk more about this. It's at the end, de Gaulle ended this process for his own reasons. There were 2 reasons to that. First, although he was the one, and he declared that he was the one who was behind that, because Shaban Delmas and the defense minister who did the first agreement in Algeria, they were all Gaullists. So de Gaulle was part of the game, and he said, I was there, I just, right from the beginning, and he gave guarantees to Italians right before coming to power that he would not really end this cooperation, but then he ended. Because it's really key to understand the difference between declarations and real policies here. And de Gaulle, France would never want a Germany rearmed. And also, they were concerned about their bilateral relationship with the United States. They wanted some technology transfers for their nuclear tests from the United States. And this is a crucial part of this research, because normally the French, in the French historiography, it is all independent French research, but apparently they received a lot of American help at that very moment when they were using this FIG as a quid pro quo in their dealings with Americans. So they came to the United States, they transferred some important some materials and knowledge in order to have a much less expensive nuclear testing, and also being able to conduct the testing itself. So this is a very crucial moment, and I think it's one of the implications of in the transatlantic of this cooperation is that transfer. So, I'm sorry. So this is, finally I want to talk about some of the arguments, implications, and which is related to my research questions. So first of all, I argue that the Soviet Union, this is understudied. The reactions of the Soviet Union and Soviet nuclear decision-making to this cooperation is understudied. It's not mentioned. And I argue that Soviet Union's cooperation, Sino-Soviet nuclear cooperation, reached its pinnacle in this very moment when this cooperation also was maturing in November 1957. So the Soviet Union signed a cooperation agreement in November, and as part of this cooperation agreement, they really came up with an unprecedented level of assistance to China. Although that cooperation started much earlier, but reaching this level was unprecedented, and all of a sudden they actually decided not to give some of the technologies, some of the material and arms that they promised them later, because they changed the policy. But it triggered that reaction, and I think it has some effects on, I argue that it had effects on the Chinese nuclear proliferation. And it's also part of my dissertation research. So here, this is an excerpt from the Communist Party, Soviet Communist Party Central Committee, addressing the communist parties in Western Europe. So they talk about the revanchist generals of West Germany who are going to get atomic weaponry. So this is pretty much an official declaration of propaganda war of the Soviet Union. And this was triggered by Fij cooperation. And here, that's also how I decided to study this topic, because I realized that I'm trying to understand anti-nuclear movements in Africa and these reactions to French nuclear tests, but at the very origins of it lies this information campaign by the Soviet Union, by looking at all these newspapers. And I argue here that they all talk about Germany, like Third Reich and Third World War. There's a lot of reference to Germany, and although one doesn't expect to have that concern in Africa, but when you see all the propaganda outlets of the Soviet Union, you see this pattern. They did that in Europe too, but it worked better in decolonizing war. And I argue that this is because decolonization had its own independent effect on these actors. And although Soviet propaganda triggered that, later it became something of its own, took its own life in a way. And again, continuing with the questions, I argue here that it began as some kind of a posturing and evolved into an alternative vision for European defense order. Right before de Gaulle came to power, it was really a mature defense project, and it would become something of its own, a European order, because everything was in place. German money, technology, French capabilities, and political leverage. And finally, it's like this is some kind of an argument in the making, but I argue here that so Americans had right from the beginning that inhibition, what is called Inhibition Mission, along with containment of the Soviet Union. So inhibition is different kinds of anti-nuclear non-proliferation policies. But when we look at that early period, there is so much inconsistency in American attitude. There are so many mixed signals coming from different actors, like Dulles, Eisenhower, Stetson, and mid-level actors. They were really ready to not problematize Germany in a way, German rearmament, nuclear armament. Nuclearization. So the argument here is that that strategy doesn't always translate into policy. In general, strategy doesn't always translate into policy, and we need to look at these complications each time when we make this general argument. And finally, just my applied history agenda. The analogy here is that I believe it was like some kind of a fully realizable building project that was competing with other projects, but it wasn't built. That building wasn't built. And that story, the story of what didn't happen, tells us a lot about to explain what happened, to explain why question of what happened. So here I want to finish with these two patterns, trends that I believe that influence today's European defense autonomy discussions. The American dilemma was maintaining America's indispensable role in European region in general, and also mitigating Europe's reliance on Washington. They wanted both. So we can see that today too, although the context is totally different, but I think that pattern is common. And European dilemma was the primacy of national defense identities. When you look at how the actors like Adenauer, de Gaulle, British, they were all coming from a really national perspective. And this is the same today. I guess that's pretty much what makes it like an applied history situation. Thank you.
So I welcome anyone to ask any questions right now. I have a few that I've written down, but I want to hear from others in the room first. Tom.
I wasn't sure I was going to say anything today because I haven't been looking at this stuff for a long time, but as I listened to it, there's a lot, and I'll try to keep it brief. I'll just say one broad comment, and then I'll say another one towards the dynamic that you're talking. I'm coming from a more German-centric point of view.
Tom, could you speak up a little bit? I'm kind of deaf, thanks.
That's all right. The broad point is I think you've got a problem. You've got two stories that you're trying to tell. One is the strategic nuclear question, and that seems to be your main push. And it's an area which has been covered by a lot of people. Mark Trachtenberg, I think, is really like central in terms of, and if you were going to talk to a different audience, you'd probably want to be engaging and showing how what you're doing is different. That's the other thing, which is the other story, which is potentially very interesting. And I wish we had some of our colleagues here, like Joya Sarkar, who used to be here. If you don't know her, I would strongly suggest.
You know my research, I presented that.
She's great, and we're sorry that she's not with us. But again, this, how the rest of the world outside of the sort of Europe, Atlantic community respond to it. And you haven't yet shown to me the connection that clearly. I know something about, for example, the Chinese issue. That was being driven by totally different dynamics. I mean, the Keimo and Matsu issue, the whole, all of that. With regard to the, I think you've got lots of things which are really interesting, and I'd love to hear and learn more from you about it. But I think there are these two contexts which I think you have to bring in. I'm sure some of the people here, established Europeanists, will say you've got to bring in more of the European integration story in terms of how that figured into the calculation of everybody involved. And then the other thing, which I would probably say is, a lot of this is intra-alliance bargaining. the Germans were well aware that they couldn't count on the French. I mean, you had multiple plans, the Pleven Plan, the EDC, and they were falling apart on the shoals of French domestic politics. And but they, at the same time, could not afford to let the French, right, go and do their own thing. They needed the French to rehabilitate them. They needed the European integration project. Westbindung was a central part of Adenauer's thing. Also, what we forget is the real fear that they had, that the French would go off and make deals with the Russians separately, which would completely screw up the whole, Adenauer's whole strategy, Ostpolitik. So, the Germans have to intra-alliance bargain with the French, and the other important bargain is with the US, because our goals were not identical with the German goals at all. And we saw this in multiple levels, and Strauss and Brentano and Huizinga were very much involved in those debates. Question about forward defense. How are we going to get the Americans to defend the German border, the inner German border, right? I mean, strategically, it didn't make any sense from the American point of view. But for the Germans, absolute political necessity. Later on, and the other thing, which again, the big context is, we are all trying to figure out how nuclear deterrence was going to work, how we were going to balance it in terms of decoupling. And what you're telling is really the story, I think, what Dulles was already beginning to grow towards the late 1950s, already clear before Sputnik, but certainly focused minds like never before after, is how are we going to do extended deterrence. And nobody understood that. The Germans' understanding, Huizinga's understanding, and Strauss's understanding is atomic weapons are going to be used on the battlefield. The US was planning to use the battlefield. I don't know if you know about the Davy Crockett, these little jeeps running around with recoilless rifles deploying 20 kiloton warheads. With the delegation at the level of a sergeant could use these damn things. And the slogan the Army had was a Davy Crockett in every pocket. I mean, we had no idea how this stuff was actually going to be implemented. And then, of course, the thing is that deterrence couldn't be considered independent of arms control. So basically what you're telling is an important part of the story which led to the final consensus which came together in 66 to 68, which was the nuclear planning group, right after the MLF, I mean the multilateral force, which is the part of the story which I'm sure you're going to deal with next. But that whole story is really interesting, really important, and then what is its relevance for today? And actually, I think the way to make this talk, one way of doing this talk, if you decide to go down the strategic angle, is just bring up Macron, who seems to be almost channeling the ghost of General Charles de Gaulle, and talk. We are talking again. The French always do this. Now more than ever, we need an independent European strategic autonomy, and that will inevitably raise the question of nuclear weapons and deterrence, which the Germans are beginning to again reluctantly go back to, and then we can learn lots of lessons. Right, about was it an alternative order, European-centric order possible? That would be one story. The other story, which I don't think is developed, is more about how that impacted nuclear proliferation. And if Joyetta were here, she'd be talking about how the French helped different people, beginning with the Israelis and the Indians, to develop the nuclear program, and how did this shape thinking, and how did that fit in uneasily with Bandung and on the line. Sorry to go on so long. I think this is a great project, interesting, lots of possibilities, but I just would bring in some of these dimensions and ask you to help me focus on these things.
Yeah, these are great points. So actually, what I'm interested for my dissertation purposes is the part where I talk about the implications in Africa, in the Soviet anti-nuclear campaign, this propaganda war. This is how it started for me. Like, I just wanted to understand what Fij is because I thought it's really important, so what it is. And then I just made this whole big project and presentation. So you're totally right. There's a lot out there, and each are different chapters in a hypothetical dissertation. So I would probably be less interested in the European angle because I know more about the American part of things because of the documents that I have. I couldn't get a visa to Europe because of my citizenship, so I can't go there for research. As a historian, that's one of the things that I want to state here too. So yes, and I think this question about the American non-proliferation policy, the strategy of containment, how this played a role in there. And the part where I talk about the French side of things is really, actually it's really original, it's part of my dissertation. So that, because I saw that FIG was at the roots of an American assistance to France, nuclear assistance, and it is also at the origins of anti-nuclear mobilization against French nuclear testing in Africa, which became a big thing and which triggered anti-nuclear movements all around the world. So that's why I decided, oh, this is an important event which couldn't materialize as an order vision, but it's really important, so I need to check what that is. So that's why it became a bit like I put everything in there here, but I just wanted to understand the whole context, how it all unfolded. And there is a lot, as you said, rightly, there are all these different levels. There's a public, there's like politics in each country, and in Germany, in France, and then there are all these actors that shape the situation. The defense minister, the Strauss is very important here. And Adenauer, he's more like, he wants it, but he's also quite pragmatic. He's just testing the waters. So it's really complicated when you look from that bottom-up level. And then there are all these strategic concerns and structural things, and I know I put them all together, but I think it's really interesting to actually study this topic, which I believe is still understudied. It's important, despite all the secrecy around it, it's important to revise that this event, its dynamics, to actually understand some of the tendencies maybe we have today. But as you said, it needs to be talked within the context of the MLF and what happens later. That's also important. So mine is more like a mission to make this topic more pronounced and prioritize it.
So thank you so much for this and for all your research. I am, because of the time, I had to zoom onto what continues the kind of response you got from Tom, which is, could we add something to this that your audience might be interested in reading? And I was thinking, if really the decolonization aspect of this is central to your curiosity, it doesn't show. It doesn't show in your insights, it doesn't show in your sources. I mean, at some point I saw an article, a journal article in Ethiopia, another one about experiments in the Sahara genetically. So there must be an African story about this. In other words, so the project still feels too Eurocentric to me. So in this room, there was a presentation of the book, The Seventh Member State by Megan Brown, which is about Algeria. And so it cannot be by coincidence that you have a treaty, a protocol signed in Colombes. Which month was it? I don't remember.
January.
January, okay. So. And in March, they write a treaty in which the only African state that is explicitly put in the Treaty of Rome is Algeria, right? With all sorts of consequences that came from putting the name expressly in there. The fact that France needed Algeria to run its own experiments was essential to that. I mean, France is realizing that the oil may be gone the moment in which they become independent, and that movement is, of course, quite likely to succeed at that point. So they want at least a land where they can do experiments that they couldn't do in Paris or in Provence. So that piece must be there. There is the story of Eurafrica by P.O. Hansen, which has regained. And when you say importance to what of your research in contemporary debates, decolonization is now really high. Is subject of renewed interest in Europeanists, among Europeanists in general. I would say if you dig the Algerian history, something is going to come up. Just like Italy, the fact that the Treaty of Rome was signed in Rome has a lot to say about what there was for Italy in this. The fact that the protocol was signed in Colombashar needs to be investigated. Now, if you find nothing in Algerian sources, which could be, at least we would learn that they were kept totally in the dark of what was happening. But my intuition is that you would find something.
In fact, my dissertation is about French nuclear tests in Algeria, and I'm looking at Euro-African debates, and also, although I can't focus on Algeria because of the access problem to French archives, because most of the Algerian sources are in France, not in Algeria. That's also part of the colonial history. But there are some people who are working on that. I want to focus more on the international politics of French nuclear tests and Euro-African discussions, all these different anti-nuclear mobilizations around the continent. An Algerian angle is there, but I need to spend at least 1 year in French archives to be able to have a strong Algerian perspective.
There are also the professors who are still alive. In other words, I have identified a couple of law professors that I hope to interview for my own work. Mm-hmm. They were alive back then, and it can't be that they have nothing to say about the period they experienced as young people.
Yeah, that's it's good to know. I would be happy to have. Yeah, thank you.
So I have a few questions that really echo Tom's point, but also Daniela's point as well. This is fantastic in terms of really grounding in a nuanced argument about a very important time frame. And so I found it gripping and nuanced and interesting, but I was also then struggling to put it into context, just like Tom was thinking about all the other things and Daniela was thinking about all the other things going on at this moment. And especially, I would push back on the idea that it's an alternate order. I wonder if, I guess I have a question, whether the actors trying to do that see it as an alternate order in a contemporaneous sense, or whether it's more of almost a layered order, or like the way Tom was talking about it, kind of a way of trying to build out room for maneuver, both diplomatically in the alliance, in terms of problem solving all these different dimensions. And I would actually what impresses me the most, or what is an overwhelming thought to me right now, was the way Tom was framing it, in that these actors are all dissatisficing in terms of trying to figure out so many things all at once. They're so exceptional. How to navigate in an enduring peacetime alliance. How to navigate in an enduring peacetime alliance with major geopolitical shifts on the outside. How to navigate new emerging weaponry. I think of things like Lawrence Friedman's work that's so fascinating, just looking at these policymakers trying to grapple in real time with what nuclear weapons are, strategically, and then what extended deterrence is. And then also what the costs of these things are. Are these exercises in trying to share costs at the beginning? So I'm trying to put it in this larger context. So 2 things, just to pull back out. I would love to know, I'm dying for the footnotes of what's happening in the rest of the page, the rest of the meetings, of references to NATO, to European defense cooperation collapsing, to the European Union, or to colonial opportunities for these things, because I know this is the contemporaneous debate going on, and that's your interest. So if you could help me with the larger context, like what these policymakers think they're doing in a larger way. But then also, what's fascinating to me and what I would read a book-length thing on is thinking about these actors as real-time kind of patient zero policymakers trying to figure this out in real time in a very, very limited rationality way. So that is a comment rather than a question, but I guess my question was what their reference, how they think of this project in a contemporary way, in a contemporaneous way.
Yeah, and these are great points. So actually, maybe I haven't been able to talk about that in detail today, but it's what they saw, like looking at the American actors, what they saw is an alternative order. They openly talk about it, or France is going into a direction that's pretty much something totally different than we envisage. They talk about it, and they even talk about that's not just a policy, it's just something more solid, something more serious. It's in the 1958, like right before it ends. And for the French, the same. They were doing these things with Germans secretly. The secrecy also meant that it wasn't just like a basic situation. It's something more serious. So they wanted to, or at least that's my impression. But from the memoirs. But maybe I need to see some more primary documents from their archives. So it's really important. I really like your interpretation, because what we historians are doing is trying to actually capture this complexity. They don't know much. All these things are happening. I try to give that in the context, like all these things happening, they were pretty much grappling with all these questions at the same time when they were doing these agreements. So yes, there is a limited rationality, definitely, and everyone's saying something at some point. That's why there is this mixed signals. And this is the reason why I'm interested in this period, because I would say, and I would argue, at least for nuclear politics, decision making, this is where the moment or a period where there were all these possibilities. And one of them gets realized and others don't. And you see what the dynamics of this, why others they are put in the trash can in a way, and one prevails over the others. So this is really, when you tell a story in a history way, it captures that complexity, but it's so difficult to do it in a social science way because of the nature of the complexity of the topic. So you need to really bring up all these networks of correlations, and they all somehow correlated with each other, and you just convey that in a history. So maybe presentation is not always a great way to do that, but when you read the history, it kind of captures. But it's also important to consider that as what are the general points and what's the reference point, right?
What would that alternative order look like? I mean, they were exploring it, and maybe when they explored it, sometimes you discover that your bright idea isn't all that bright after all. Happens to me all the time. But I mean, seriously, what would that order look like?
So counterfactually, first of all, the Soviet Union, there will be really a lot of tensions with them because they were much more serious about that red line for them. German nuclearization was a red line. And so even if we just take Soviet Union out of the context and just consider there's only United States and Europe, I think in this case, it would still be really difficult because at the end, I believe that this project, it would look like a United States which will be much less engaged in the world, having much less economic and defense contractual procurement relations with Europe. And politically, it would mean that there would be some kind of a more emphasis on Asia, which was also at that time one of the options. Before Eisenhower, there were all these alternative thinking about how to anchor in Asia rather than Europe.
U.S. anchoring in Asia.
Yes. That's a really interesting discussion. That's not my research, but it's before Eisenhower came to power, before the first election. He was competing with the Democratic candidate, and there were all these discussions out there about the anchoring. And Europeans were afraid of that. They wanted the United States to be more engaging in Europe at that period. So that's also part of I think that's one of the, one can say, bifurcation points where you see all these different projects that don't realize. But I think it was still a possibility, this Fij, although it hit much strongly to Soviet red card than the American one.
So you answered the question of what we're going to wrap this up. I just wanted to give one more comment and question. You answered the question of what the implications of that alternate order would look like. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, what the alternate order would have been at its core more intra-European defense sovereignty and autonomy, which is, for thematic purposes, this really impressed upon me even more granular details. There is a there to this constant organic attempt from, Plevenplan on, to constantly be trying to generate this. And so I think from a presentist point of view, a 2023 or a 2019 perhaps point of view, people look at European defense cooperation and say, oh, isn't there, it's a history of failures. But if you look at it from the bottom up or from, through the years, you see a constant, like mole, whack-a-mole, mole coming back up, mole coming back up, mole coming back up. That's why I saw it not as an exceptional order, but as a constant phenomenon of that attempt, thematically. And so this really enriched that for me, the granularity of the constant organic attempt to create European defense autonomy within NATO or adjacent. But the thing I wanted to say was what I loved, and this is for another talk, if you looked at all of that, when you showed the newspaper articles about all that Soviet propaganda about a fear of nuclear Germany in African newspapers, it occurred to me that is an incredibly inorganic fear, because in sub-Saharan Africa there aren't organic concerns about German power. That is a wonderful research design to look at what news articles were propaganda and which ones weren't, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I think that's what you were trying to convey to us, and I wanted to confirm that I got that.
Yeah. I actually, in my dissertation, that's what I'm trying to do, trying to see when exactly the propaganda didn't work and the anti-colonial ideology, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism took its hold there. And I think there's a point in 1959. So looking at more at the discourse of the articles, but it's a really great question to maybe prioritize and to make more pronounced in my presentation. Thank you.
All right.